They told me I wasn't invited the week the invitations went out. "We didn't invite you." It was a short, flat sentence. My mother's voice, the same clipped tone she used for dentist appointments and insurance renewals, delivered without ornament or apology. The date anchors matter. The invitations were mailed the week of October 17, 2016. The anniversary they celebrated fell on November 12, 2016, 38 years since their wedding in 1978. Those calendar points give the story its skeleton: 18 months of small labor preceding the date, from May 2015 through the anniversary in November 2016. A box left on the stoop on the morning of November 12, and 2 summers later, my father's 71st birthday in the summer of 2018 that my sister chose to skip. Those facts do not change. The dates make the pattern visible. In a town like mine, where weather and ritual kept the communal calendar, an anniversary was hardly private. For 38 years the same cake had been expected, the same chairs held the same people, the same stories taped to the diner wall. After the mills closed in the mid-1990s and Main Street rearranged its storefronts, rituals like birthdays and anniversaries served as civic glue. To be left off that particular ledger did not feel like a minor social oversight. It felt like erasure. It felt like being repositioned from actor to margin. For 18 months before that November morning, I had done the unnoticed work that kept the house functional. From May 2015 through November 2016, I paid pharmacy receipts beneath harsh fluorescent lights, signed forms at midnight, drove across county lines to repair a furnace in January, and brought rice home when the cupboards ran thin. I recorded those acts: receipts, train tickets, gas stubs, annotated photographs, a cassette labeled "Listen at Night," and a key taped to an envelope that opened the old cedar trunk in the attic. Those objects were not dramatic, they were evidence of attendance. I had assembled the parcel like a curator of small facts. On top I tied a navy ribbon, the thin cord I remembered around my first school lunch bag, and wrote a note, for later. "Read this if you want to remember." Beneath the paper I placed dated photographs. My father's freckled hand with a small comb scar from renovating the porch in 1989, my mother's flour-dusted knees over a collapsed gingerbread house on December 24, 1994, a county fair photo from July 3, 1995, sunburned noses and sticky cotton candy. I dated them: July 3, 1995, county fair; December 24, 1994, gingerbread. There were pharmacy slips from May 2015 through November 2016, hospital pamphlets circled in my handwriting, an invitation stub from my college graduation in 2003, and the cassette recorder. I had written down precise moments in time: June 12, 2015, I brought the rice; January 2, 2016, I stayed overnight and turned off the heating vents, because memory anchored to dates was harder to ignore. When my mother delivered those 3 words, I had rehearsed many responses: retorts, legalistic refusals, theatrical denunciations. None felt honest. I kept the decision to the objects I had gathered and, between 9:15 and 9:30 on November 12, 2016, left the box on the stoop. I wanted it to be discovered after the party, outside the theater of candles and clinking crystal, where the proofs of my presence might be read in private. The celebration inside followed the family's long script. Crystal came out, winter vacation stories were retold with the soft punctuation of habit. My name surfaced only as absence, an edge around sentences the talk avoided. The parcel sat by the shoe rack like a pause readable only to someone paying attention. After the guests left and the house sank into quieter tones, my mother found the package. She called my father's name. Curiosity tied her voice to memory. They opened the lid at the kitchen table with the careful motions of people who keep things that matter. I had not left a manifesto. I had left an inventory. They played the cassette after the plates had been cleared. The television turned low so the room would not feel like an audience. Through the hiss of magnetic tape my voice read letters I had written over months. Plain, dated accounts of small labor. On June 12, 2015, I brought the rice because it was the small thing the pantry needed, and on January 2, 2016, I stayed overnight and turned off the heating vents because the old furnace clicked like a tired animal. The tape offered scenes with dates and the plain weight of accounting. It did not yell. It asked the house to remember me as a series of actions, not just as a child who once sat on a stepstool. When the tape clicked off, the room held its breath. My mother began to cry softly, My father buried his face in his hands. They found the key taped to the envelope and unfolded my letter. I had written without rage. I had not left this as a trap but as a test of remembering. If you want me back, call me. I had written. It was a small, enormous opening, an invitation to acknowledgement, not a demand for forgiveness. That night they called. My mother's voice trembled with careful sorrow, my father's was halting. He admitted they had shortened the guest list after an argument with my sister and described the decision as practical, a culling to keep things simple. In a town where reputation mattered and gossip could surge like spring water, the impulse to avoid trouble had some interior logic. Their words explained motive but could not erase the hurt. I did not return the evening they called. I sat in my one-bedroom apartment and listened to their messages: sorrow, clumsy contrition, small admissions. The next morning my mother called again. "We read your letter," she said. A few hours later my father said, "We were wrong." Those two words landed both expected and disorienting. For someone who had months of receipts and stubs, receiving a live admission felt like testing how the body takes apology. We met at the kitchen table a few days later, not in a novel's crescendo, but in a place thick with memory. We spoke first of practical things, prescriptions needing refilling, the roofing estimate I had paid in March 2016, the train stubs tucked between photographs. I did not demand a complete ledger of wrongs. I accepted their narrower apologies, throwaway jokes that turned my job into a punchline, cards that had been discarded, the way my name had been spoken as if it were not attached to a living person, and let that narrowness be a beginning. Repair in families is not a dramatic redemption arc. It is slow, ordinary labor. Over the months that followed, rebuilding was modest. Texts about appointments, loaves of bread left at the doorstep, promises to attend medical visits. My father began to ask about my work with genuine curiosity rather than teasing dismissal. My mother rewound and replayed a fragment of the cassette until her hand cramped. She wept over a photograph of me with a crooked ice cream cone. These shifts were small but real. Not everyone moved toward repair. My sister, who had played a central role in the decision to cull the guest list, refused to step back. She called the cassette manipulative and the box theatrical. Her absence was a clean, sharp grief, an ugly fact I could not change. She skipped my father's 71st birthday in the summer of 2018. Her refusal became a permanent notch in the family's map. Other tests arrived without fanfare. In November 2017, the anniversary was quieter, held in the backyard among my father's vegetable beds. He tended beans in rows and staked tomatoes with methodical devotion. The cake came in a Tupperware container rather than a decorated confection. Mismatched plates dotted the table. Empty chairs asked questions. My sister's absence was jagged, but a neighbor who once had been a casual acquaintance brought a pie and sat beside me. A cousin offered a small, awkward toast to truth. These were not reconciliations, but they were changes in the tide. One rainy afternoon in March 2019, I rode a bus across town to clear my mother's attic. Men like my father had kept boxes labeled "Someday" and "Keep." At the bottom of the cedar trunk we found their wedding program, yellowed at the edges. My mother unfolded it and the paper trembled between her fingers. "We did wrong. We were mean," she said. It was not absolution, it was a small, unadorned recognition. That attic afternoon felt like confirmation that the box had done its work. It had opened conversations that habit had hardened. The box thereafter served quieter roles. I would pull a train stub during an argument to locate a shared memory. A receipt steadied a friend who wanted proof of continuity. The artifacts were not weapons but tools, asking a simple question: "Do you remember who this person has been?" Public reaction was varied. Some called the act brave, others said it was a stunt. People projected motives. A few reduced my gesture to manipulation in Facebook threads or over coffee at the diner. Those accusations hurt because they refused curiosity. But other people, neighbors who dropped casseroles when I was sick, a partner who learned to accept apology without spectacle, cousins who offered quiet notes of regret, became part of a chosen family. They showed up because they wanted to, not because blood required them to. Time softened and sharpened in uneven ways. There were relapses, occasional careless jokes and offhand comments, but these slips became chances to correct rather than to condemn. Boundaries broke old grammars into new vocabulary. When my father introduced me awkwardly as "this is my child," I accepted the tenderness. When he reverted briefly to an old joke, I said plainly, "I didn't invite that comment." He stopped. That small silence was serious punctuation. A boundary had been set. I learned another discipline, refusing to weaponize artifacts. It was tempting to produce receipts like talismans across a table. I resisted. Memory is not a club. Instead, I used the box gently, to steady a conversation or remind someone that consistent care had been given. Once, in fierce temptation, I placed the box on the kitchen table and imagined waving it like a flag. I put it away instead. Stewardship became an ethic. The neighborhood reconfigured kinship. People who had been peripheral became central. A neighbor who brought lasagna in 2017 became the person who checked when the power went out. A partner who learned to hold apology became someone who could say, "He's trying." These new intimacies sometimes had more muscle than old family ties. Not everything healed. My sister remained constant in her refusal. She told me in terse messages that the box was manipulative and that she would not join a narrative she had not chosen. I learned to live with that absence. Our communications are now like two boats in a channel, close enough to see each other's lanterns, not always aligned by wind. There are moments of tenderness and long stretches of distance. I manage the grief as its own thing. There were other dates that marked the cadence of repair and relapse. In March 2016, I had paid a roofing estimate. In 2003, I had graduated college, an envelope stub I included as a small proof of attendance. On February nights in 2020, when the world felt harsher, I turned to the box for steadiness. The artifacts did not erase harm, but they made it harder for people to treat my presence as invisible. A photograph could be tender and sharp at once. A receipt could be proof and a minor sting. The box's intent was never punitive. It sought to calibrate memory so that recollection would pull actions toward accountability. What I kept learning was practical. When someone tells you, "We didn't invite you," decide what preserves your dignity. Walk away if that is the healthy choice. Leave a box on a stoop if you feel it necessary. The point is to do what allows you to sleep without replaying the evening on loop. For me, the box was not a period at the end of a story, it was an opening, a public record of private tending. Recognition is different from reunion. Recognition asks only that your existence be noted and your labor seen. Reunion asks for a larger surrender. The box invited recognition. What followed depended on the people who received it. Some stepped forward, some kept their distance. Years later, after attic afternoons and backyard cakes and quiet dinners where the television was a low glow, I measure belonging differently. I no longer weigh it only by who sits around a table on a certain evening. I measure it by small acts at doorways, a loaf of bread, a cassette tape, an envelope with a key. These humble objects tell you, more reliably than invitations, who will carry you through cold nights. They tell you who the family has become, not merely persons connected by blood, but those who enact care. The ledger of daily ministrations has a cumulative force. Over time my mother learned to say my name with gentleness. My father began to ask questions with the intent to understand. Cousins wrote apologies. Those are not dramatic reconciliations, but they add up. They are the steady, ordinary labor that holds a life. If you ask me now what I would do if someone said to you in that municipal, clipped voice, "We didn't invite you," I have only a modest answer. Do what keeps you whole. For me, the stoop and the box were a calibrated act of presence, a way to make visible a series of small, continuous cares. I did not expect uniform consent to that invitation. I expected people to choose. Family, in my experience, is mutable. Some members stay, some bridge the gap, others retreat. New people anchor themselves in ways relatives cannot. The artifacts on my shelf, photographs, a cassette, a key taped to an envelope, acted as a public record of private care. They asked us to look without insisting on a particular outcome. In the end, the simplest question kept returning. When someone tells you, "We didn't invite you," how do you answer? The only sensible response is the one that preserves your dignity. For me, leaving a box on a stoop and a note that read, "Read this if you want to remember," was an invitation, to recognition, to reckoning, to whatever each person chose afterward. The months after 2019 changed the box's function without altering its essential logic. In the late spring of 2019, after the attic afternoon when my mother unfolded the wedding program and said, "We did wrong. We were mean," the artifacts takes on a new layer of work. They became anchors against the slow diversion of memory. That summer, when my father's 71st birthday passed in July 2018 and my sister did not appear, I had thought absence would calcify into a settled shape. Instead, absence turned into a pattern layered over with small quotidian proofs. In November 2019 we celebrated an anniversary in a kitchen lit by a single lamp and the hiss of a gas stove. My father asked me, for the first time in years, whether I wanted the last slice of cake. He insisted, in a manner halfway between deferential and embarrassed, that I take it. These were quiet transactions, but they mattered. Then the calendar turned toward 2020, and the world tightened. I remember the moment with a specificity that is now a kind of compass. February nights in 2020, cold, the windows fogged, when the news began to arrive with a different cadence. On March 11, 2020, when institutions began to close and the town's library plastered a sign announcing curtailed hours, we slipped into an unfamiliar caution. The box's artifacts, which had been pulled out for memory and mending, found new uses as anchors for remote presence. The cassette that once required a tape player became a file. On March 20, 2020, with the simplest tools at hand, I took the cassette to a small storefront that digitized tapes. The technician told me plainly that people were bringing in old formats because confinement made the past feel less remote. He gave me a thumb drive on which the voices of my parents and the creak of the tape were captured. I began sending snippets in text threads and on slow video calls. Hearing my mother's laugh compressed into a digital clip in April 2020 felt, despite the strange medium, like holding a moment out to someone who could not come through the door. Lockdown altered the choreography of care. The physical box remained on my shelf, but its contents moved into circulation. Envelopes were photographed and sent, a train stub's image placed into a message with the caption, "Remember this trip?" We created new rituals. Sundays, when my parents and a few neighbors who were not related but had become important assembled on stoops 6 feet apart, I brought out the photographs and placed them on a folding table. Neighbors who had once been the kind of people with whom you exchanged weather now told longer stories. How they had known my father at the Rotary for years, how my mother had once brought a jar of blackberry jam to someone with a broken furnace. The box's items made those stories legible. In June 2020, after the first wave of restrictions loosened, we met in the backyard under the tomatoes my father tended. He had always been precise with their rows. Even with a mask hanging under his chin, he demonstrated how to trim suckers and where to tie a vine. The wedding program from the cedar trunk, yellowed and fragile, sat on a small plastic chair as if it were another guest. My mother held it when she spoke. "We have lived long enough to see when we were wrong," she said. That language mattered because it named a time, not just the night of the anniversary that first broke us, but the slow accrual of small untruths. Yet even amid these strides, my sister's distance remained absolute. She declined the backyard invitation by text. She would not, she wrote, be part of performative reparations. Her reply was dated June 14, 2020. The date sat in the thread like an ice chip. The months that followed pivoted around public health and private logistics. In January 2021, vaccination campaigns reached our county. On January 23, 2021, my father called to say he had his appointment for the first dose for the local clinic. He was nervous about driving and asked whether I could go with him. I went and photocopied the small card that showed his inoculation date, a slip of paper with a stamp of healthcare, a bureaucratic artifact that joined the others. On February 20, 2021, after his second dose, my mother taped the card to the inside lid of the cedar trunk, where the wedding program lay, as if to say that vaccination was now part of the family's enduring ledger. When my sister texted to say she had received hers at a different clinic that same month, the exchange was brisk and arm's length. The facts were exchanged like receipts, not reconciliations. The box, for its part, collected new things and new meanings. Between 2020 and 2022, I slid into the box a used blender warranty my mother had clung to, a grocery list in shaky ink from August 2021 that included milk, bread, sympathy, a joke she had, a shorthand for consolation, and a small, creased note from my father that read, "Try the beans before they go," with the date June 6, 2021. These were humble additions, but they became connective tissue. On long winter nights in December 2021, when a snowstorm snarled the county roads and the town's main street's Christmas lights blinked through the dark, my parents and I would sit 5 feet apart in the living room. My father would produce a receipt from March 2016, the roofing estimate I had paid, and hold it up. "This," he would say, with a voice that tried to be both grateful and precise, "is the physical evidence of when you were here to help." The words were small and official in their way, a ledger entry made flesh. Public perception and the town's rumors continued in parallel. In some quarters I was called dramatic for leaving the box on their stoop that first time in 2016, in others my gesture was framed as a lesson in accountability. People argued about the ethics of public remonstration versus private conversation. In the diner on Main Street in March 2022, I heard a woman I'd known since childhood say aloud that she admired the way I had assembled evidence rather than accusations. A man at the counter clicked his tongue and offered that families simply need to toughen up. These were external conversations that did not change the box's material purpose, but they did shape who showed up for the work of repair. Repair, over the years, clarified itself as an accumulation of small decisions. In August 2022, my father celebrated his 75th year. We did not throw a party, we did something less theatrical and more honest. We made tomato preserves and labeled the jars with the date August 7, 2022. My mother wrote little annotations on the back, "Too sweet" on one, "Good for toast" on another, and taped them to the jars. On the shelf next to the preserves sat the cedar trunk with its wedding program and vaccination card, a shelf that got lent light by the afternoon sun. My sister did not attend. She texted a photograph of a lake she was visiting and wrote, "I hope he's well." The message read like a postcard, polite, distant. Elegies took time to form. There were moments when the box's role shifted toward the administrative. In late 2022, my father began to misplace small items more frequently. Keys, a reading glass of which he had 3 copies, and there was a mild creeping worry about memory. We began to make lists. On October 12, 2022, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything we thought might be needed, a list of medications and dosages, insurance phone numbers, the contact for our neighbor who could drive us to the clinic if roads iced over. We added to the cedar trunk a printout of our doctor's contact and a copy of that roofing estimate from March 2016. The box that had once been a ledger of hurt became a living filing cabinet. Its contents performed both sentimental and practical labor. I learned how small objects can become repositories for plans. In March 2023, the town organized a small history exhibit in the library. The volunteer group that chronicled lives across the county wanted to show how ordinary households had navigated the pandemic. Someone from the committee came by and asked permission to include a photograph of my parents in the show. We agreed, and the exhibit featured a cropped image of my mother at a kitchen table with a jam jar in hand, the label dated August 7, 2022 tucked into the frame's lower corner. The display placed our private mending in a public context. For a few weeks the photo sat among other domestic scenes, a poster of masks made by children, an old ledger from the butcher's shop. The exhibit's curator left a note that read, "Small acts became our public story." At least in that corner of municipal memory, the box's logic was legible. Small acts of care, recorded and indexed, had been the work of survival. Patterns, however, are not always linear. In June 2023, my father had a fall in the garden. He was not seriously hurt, but the incident was a pivot. He got up with a bruise and a stubborn refusal to treat himself as vulnerable. He tucked a bandage into his shirt pocket and insisted he would be fine. The fall prompted a conversation about wheels and thresholds and whether the house, a narrow 2-bedroom with a back porch, would be safe for the long term. On June 18, 2023, we convened to discuss options. The cedar trunk that once held the wedding program now held lists of phone numbers for contractors and a couple of brochures about single-level homes in the county. The box, which had begun as a narrative device to insist on being seen, now contained potential trajectories. Home safety measurements, comparisons of mobility aids, the names of local handymen, objects that once recorded history now shaped the future. My sister remained outside these conversations, but not entirely silent. In September 2023, she sent 2 postcards to my mother, one from a small coastal town with a photo of a lighthouse, the second a plain card that said, "Thinking of you." They arrived with no annotation of attendance at any forthcoming family event, and when my mother thanked her by phone she replied, "I will come for the big things." That phrase, "the big things," hung ambiguous. What someone regarded as big was not always what another thought necessary. For my mother and father, a jar of preserves and a patch of tended soil were ordinary things. For my sister, perhaps a different scale defined importance. The box continued to mediate. In October 2023, I added an envelope with paperwork that my mother had insisted should be kept together. A copy of a will drafted in 2015, a deed to the house, the insurance policy. The handwriting on the envelope read, "Keep, do not throw away." I respected their instruction. The materials were not melodramatic but sober, small necessities that helped us plan. In late November, with winter looming, we had to decide whether my parents would winter in the house or whether we should visit weekly to clear leaves and check the furnace. On November 27, 2023, after a storm took down a limb in the neighbor's yard and the power blinked, we agreed to a simple division of labor. I would visit twice weekly. A neighbor would snowblow the walking path. My sister did not offer to help, and her absence was a continuing, unhealed line. There were other public reckonings that intersected with personal repair. In January 2024, the town council debated zoning changes, and a few of my neighbors, people who had become family in their own right, came to the meetings because the proposed changes might affect the old brick bakery where my mother had once worked. I sat in the back of the small hall with the Cedar Trunk's wedding program scanning in my mind as a symbol of an older sort of anchored life, of people who had lived through different economies and still tended their beans. The council's decision on February 3, 2024, to preserve the bakery as a community historic site felt, oddly, like another piece of validation, small lives held in the municipal memory. By spring 2024, repair had a rhythm that included both presence and planning. We had catalogued the Cedar Trunk's contents into a typed list with dates: 2003, college graduation stub; March 2016, roofing estimate paid; June 2019, wedding program found in trunk; August 7, 2022, jars of tomato preserves labeled; October 12, 2022, medical contacts and medication list. Writing the list made the ledger legible to people beyond our household. I made 2 copies. One remained taped to the inside lid of the trunk, the other I left with the neighbor who had become our informal emergency contact. This act of duplication felt like a small insurance against forgetting. Not all moments were gentle. In May 2024, an argument about a stained glass window in the living room, which my mother insisted should remain undisturbed and my father wanted to reframe as a health hazard, turned sharp enough that a neighbor later remarked how strange it was to see our family animated with such intensity over a mundane object. The moment was raw because the window had been a touchstone since their wedding. It was, as these objects often are, both sentimental and stubborn. The Cedar Trunk's wedding program proved again a mediator. My mother produced it and traced, with a weakened finger, a line in the margin where their names were printed. "We said these things," she told my father. "We promised." The argument cooled into a conversation about whose autonomy mattered and when preservation outweighed safety. These were the kinds of negotiations families live within for years. Throughout all this, the core question, how to respond when someone says, "We didn't invite you," kept returning. In private and in public, the answer remained pragmatic: do what preserves your dignity. The Cedar Trunk and the box had started as a deliberate reply to exclusion. They had become an instrument of care and record. They changed in utility across the years. They became a digital thumb drive in March 2020. They became a list kept in the neighbor's hall by November 2023. They were a set of preserves labeled August 7, 2022 in the pantry. Each iteration asked us to attend. If I have learned anything else in these years, it is this: that people are slow to change, and that change, when it comes, is usually mundane. The civic and personal contortions of 2020 to 2024 did not resolve old absences. My sister's refusal to engage remained a persistent ache, and it required me to cultivate acceptance as its own practice. Reconciliation, where it happened, was composed of 1,000 small acts: a loaf of bread left on a doorstep in January 2021, a cassette digitized on March 20, 2020, a jar of preserves labeled August 7, 2022, a printed list of medications taped inside a trunk on October 12, 2022. Each datum accumulated into a way of living that felt safer and more honest than before. There are more decisions ahead, about maintenance, about the house, about the ways we continue to reframe memory so that it is neither a weapon nor a talisman. The box will continue to be a part of that work. It will hold new items and perhaps, someday, fewer of the old. It will remain, if only for a while longer, a modest archive of ordinary care and stubborn presence, a set of small proofs that, over years and amid absences, still ask the question of anyone who will listen, who will carry the light through the coming dark, and by what actions will they be known. The months that followed settled into a ledgered rhythm. On July 15, 2024, after a home safety visit from a county occupational therapist, we received a written assessment that I taped to the inside lid of the cedar trunk. The paper, dated and stamped, recommended non-invasive changes, a threshold ramp for the back door, grab bars beside the bathtub, clearer lighting along the back path. The contractor we consulted sent an estimate on August 2, 2024, $2,150 for the ramp and railing, $480 for grab bars with installation, an optional estimate of $900 to widen the bathroom doorway. We debated the optional items as if deciding the plot of a small play. In the end, we installed the ramp and the grab bars on August 20, 2024, and I added the receipt and a small Polaroid of the finished work to the trunk, another datum, another stitch. On October 10, 2024, my mother signed up for the town meal delivery program at the community center. The volunteer coordinator left a leaflet that stated the schedule clearly: Tuesdays and Fridays, 11:30 a.m. The program required a contact, and on the form we listed the neighbor who had been shoveling our path since November 27, 2023. His name and phone number joined the list already taped to the trunk's inner lid. These bureaucratic acts, forms filled in with their tidy boxes and fax numbers, read like small oaths. We would not let logistics be the cause of neglect. Winter of 2024 to 2025 proved quieter in the outward sense but more tender at the core. There were checkups. On February 9, 2025, my father underwent a routine cognitive screening after I observed a pattern of brief disorientation when he read his morning paper. He would, on occasion, misread dates and confuse appointments. The result, recorded in a typed letter from the clinic dated February 16, 2025, diagnosed what the physician termed mild cognitive impairment. The letter was gentle and specific: strategies for memory aids, calendars in large print, the suggestion of a follow-up in 6 months. My mother folded the letter and, in her careful script, wrote across the top, "Keep, discuss with family." That sheet, like a small bell, joined the other papers in the cedar trunk. The diagnosis changed the tenor of our planning without appending it. On March 11, 2025, I made a digital copy of the trunk's inventory. The list began with the knowns: 2003, college graduation stub; March 2016, roofing estimate paid; June 2019, wedding program found in trunk; August 7, 2022, jars of tomato preserves labeled; October 12, 2022, medical contacts and medication list. The new items were appended chronologically: July 15, 2024, OT home assessment; August 20, 2024, ramp installed; February 16, 2025, clinic letter, mild cognitive impairment. I saved the file on a thumb drive, labeled it trunk_archive_2025, and printed a copy of the index which I taped beside the trunk's list in case the drive failed. Redundancy had become a moral imperative. Small community rituals amplified the sense of being seen. On April 2, 2025, the County Historical Society announced an expanded exhibit that would include not only the pandemic-era snapshots presented in March 2023 but a new wing called Domestic Practices. The curator called and asked permission to photograph the preserves again, this time including the cedar trunk in the frame. The curator said, "People are looking for continuity, for objects that explain how life kept moving." We consented. The photograph, taken on April 18, 2025, showed the trunk with its lid open, the wedding program at the top and, perched like a small, defiant proof, the jar labeled August 7, 2022. The image joined a rotating online catalog that documented how households transformed ordinary objects into civic narratives. Perhaps the most telling shifts occurred in human habits rather than legal documents. On May 12, 2025, my father began to rely openly on the wall calendar we kept in the kitchen. He circled dates with a felt pen the way he once circled fishing tournaments on summer boards. We scheduled a weekly review on Sunday evenings, appointments, medication refills, which neighbor would pick up milk. The ritual was less about control than about acknowledgement. The cedar trunk, once an artifact of protest and of memory, had become a daily operating manual. Its presence was a kind of domestic governance. The trunk's contents spoke the language of continuity: deeds, receipts, power of attorney forms to be considered, copies of the vitamins my mother insisted we alphabetize. I took steps to formalize authority where needed. On June 1, 2025, with signatures witnessed by the notary at the bank, my mother and I completed a limited durable power of attorney for financial matters. The document carried the bank stamp and a note in my mother's handwriting, to avoid trouble. The paper went into a plastic sleeve and into the trunk. I recorded the action in my log and informed our neighbor, who collected our mail every other Tuesday. The move felt administrative and intimate at once. It was both a way to prevent fraud and a declaration of trust. Family dynamics continued to complicate the arithmetic of care. My sister's pattern of being there for the big things remained as ambiguous as ever. She called on May 5, 2025, a brief voice note that mentioned she was busy with work travel, and she sent a payment toward the ramp on June 20, 2025, along with a short message: "Glad you did the ramp. See you at the next one." The next one was undefined. It took us almost a year to agree on what constituted a big thing. For my mother, big often meant ritual and recognition: anniversaries, a Sunday service, the annual potluck at the firehouse. For my father, whose world had narrowed and yet retained its old parameters, gardening schedules, the bakery's hours, big things were the steady repetition of a life well tended. August 7th returned, as it always did, with its small accruals of meaning. We had labeled jars of preserves with that date in 2022. In 2025 the date felt like a cadence. On July 29, 2025, we decided to mark the anniversary modestly: a late afternoon tea, 2 slices of the pound cake my mother could still bake without reading from a recipe, a reading aloud of the wedding program they had kept in the trunk since June 2019. The invitation list was small by design. I phoned the neighbor who had shoveled our snow since 2023. He accepted and brought an extra chair. I called a cousin who lived 2 towns over. She said she would stop by. I texted my sister with the time and place. She replied with an emoji, not quite a yes. On August 7th, 2025, the day itself was mild. The light came low across the back porch and fell like a wash across the jars on the kitchen counter. My parents greeted our few guests with restrained hospitality. We did not call the gathering a party. My father made a joke about the pound cake and my mother brushed flour from her hands as if nothing had changed. At some point in the afternoon, I left the room and returned with a small cardboard box that I had wrapped earlier that week. It was the same box that had been performing several roles for years: gift, archive, instrument of reconciliation. Inside I had placed 3 items intended to be both practical and symbolic: a new kitchen timer, for keeping time without relying on calendars, a neatly labeled flash drive with scanned family photos and the typed inventory of the cedar trunk, and a jar of tomato preserves with a fresh label that read August 7, 2022, too sweet, good for toast. The same annotations my mother had scrawled in 2022. I carried the box to the table and set it in front of them with a soft, "Open it." My father laughed first. There was a hesitation in his fingers, as if memory was a currency traded with care. My mother peered at the box and then, after a moment that seemed longer than it ought, broke out into a grin. "We didn't invite you," she said, half in jest and half in the old, clipped way that families can deploy to make room for intimacy. The words landed exactly where they were meant: a tiny offense reframed as humor, an invitation to witness. Then, as if the act of opening could also open a door inside her, my mother lifted the lid. When she saw the jar and the flash drive, her hands trembled in a way she had not allowed herself to do in front of guests in years. She read the label aloud: August 7, 2022. She turned to the wedding program in the trunk. She traced their printed names and then looked at me and said simply, "You remembered." The neighbor cleared his throat. The cousin looked away briefly, eyes wet. My sister, who had come quietly at the last minute, arriving while the cake was cooling, stood near the doorway with her hands in her coat pockets. She had not sent a text saying she would come. She had shown up without fanfare. Perhaps the big thing she had mentioned months ago had been the anniversary after all, though whether she would have come had the box not been present is a question of motive I did not intend to measure. The box functioned as a kind of public proof, an evidence pile that made private labor legible. In the weeks that followed August 7, 2025, my sister's participation shifted incrementally. On September 2 she brought a set of seeds for my father's raised bed. She said they were for the tomatoes. On October 14 she called to ask if my mother needed a ride to the clinic for a follow-up. I booked the appointment and wrote the time on the kitchen calendar. These actions were small and unadorned, and they did not erase old absences. They altered the ratio of presence to absence. Years have taught me to read small changes for what they might be worth. On November 5, 2025, the town's volunteer coordinator sent an email with a simple subject line, "Emergency Contact Update." I added my sister's number as a secondary contact and included a note in the trunk stating who was authorized to pick up medications. We did the paperwork because we had acquired a pragmatic understanding of contingency. The cedar trunk accumulated these layers like tree rings. Each addition was both a record and a protection. There are, of course, elements of care that cannot be anticipated. On March 10, 2026, my father fell ill with a respiratory infection that required a brief hospital stay. The clinic note dated March 15, 2026, recommended a period of convalescence and a reassessment of medication. The trunk received a new envelope that week, hospital discharge papers, a medication chart, a list of who would visit when. I took a week of leave from my work. My sister came twice in that fortnight and, on one of her visits, sat at the kitchen table and helped my mother count pills into the little plastic daily boxes we had bought in January 2025. Those boxes, with days printed in blue, sat like small promises on the counter. Throughout 2026, we kept tending the ledger. On April 6, 2026, the town published the updated Historical Society catalogue. Our photograph of the trunk and preserves appeared with a short caption attributing the items to domestic continuity, 2020 to 2026. On June 18, 2026, the anniversary of our family meeting to discuss thresholds in 2023, we reviewed the budgets for home maintenance and set aside funds for a more substantial bathroom redesign should it become necessary. We added a new entry to the trunk, the contractor's estimate and the name of an occupational therapist recommended by the county. We scheduled an assessment for August. There is a way in which these chronological notes form a story whose axis is not dramatic rupture but sustained presence. Each date and paper and small economy of gifts are less archaeological than functional. They are attempts to make future days legible to those who will have to inhabit them. The cedar trunk remains central to that project because it is both repository and argument. It argues, in quiet, that care is an accumulation, that the small annotations handwriting the jar labels, the receipts, the photocopied insurance cards, all orient what might otherwise dissolve into forgetfulness. We do not know how all this ends. We have, as of late summer 2026, more checks written and fewer assumptions about what any of us can do alone. My sister's presence is not steady, and that absence persists as an ache, yet it shares space now with a series of small convenings and a widening net of neighbors and municipal supports. My parents remain at home for the moment. The trunk still sits on the shelf by the pantry, its contents tending toward the quotidian, an updated inventory typed on June 30, 2026, receipts for the March hospital stay, the little Polaroid taken on August 20, 2024 of the ramp that has kept them safe in wet weather. The jar labeled August 7, 2022 remains, perhaps more symbolic now than edible, but the flash drive has also proved durable, digital files, scanned documents, a recording of my father's voice reading a line from their wedding program that he no longer remembers having said. The recording, saved on March 2, 2026 and also burned to a disk, is a small defiant object against erasure. In the end, the lesson has been iterative more than revelatory. People and institutions do not always rearrange themselves to provide consolation. Sometimes they bend only in the face of sustained, practical insistence. We have learned to build that insistence from many parts. Lists, envelopes, neighbors' names, a town's decision to preserve a bakery, a small public archive that understands domestic acts as civic ones. The box that began as an answer to exclusion has never been a cure-all. It has been a tool, a language for requesting help and a repository for promises kept and promises to be kept. It moves the conversation forward without finality because life itself refuses neat closures. The trunk, the calendar, the labeled jars, they all form a kind of scaffolding in which we continue to live toward whatever comes next. The occupational therapist arrived on August 12, 2026, at precisely 9 in the morning, a climate-controlled van idling on the street and a clipboard tucked under her arm like a bookmark. She wore sensible shoes and a name badge that read Lucy Ramirez, OTR/L, and she spoke in the measured cadence of someone used to translating bodies into plans. Her assessment was methodical. She timed my father's transfer from the armchair to his feet, noted the angle of the pantry door, measured the clearance of the hallway that led to the bathroom, and slipped a small flashlight under the sink to show where shadows made reading labels difficult. She recorded heart rates, asked whether a handrail had ever been used on the back steps, and asked my mother, gently, whether she found it easier to stand at the stove with a step stool or to sit and tend the pans. She wrote recommendations on an official form and then, because she had looked at the cedar trunk and the wristband label on the jar, she knelt and asked if she might copy the inventory's heading into her notes. I said yes. Her conclusions were not theatrical. On August 12, 2026, Lucy recommended a suite of home modifications she described as low-risk, high-yield. Widen the bathroom doorway by 6 inches to allow for a walker if necessary, replace the tub with a curbless shower, install grab bars at hip and shoulder height, raise the toilet seat to an ergonomic height, retask the hallway lighting to a motion-sensing nightlight, and secure the threshold of the back porch. She suggested an adaptive shower bench, a handheld showerhead, and non-slip tile. She also recommended ordering an occupational therapy follow-up in 3 months and suggested that a physical therapist assess my father's gait if he reported any new episodes of dizziness. At the end of her visit, she produced a list of local contractors she trusted, 2 names, an ETA for work sequencing, and a disclaimer about insurance. Her final note, dated August 12, 2026, read, "Begin modestly. Build redundancy. Enlist community." The contractor estimates began to arrive in September. On September 9, 2026, Mason & Company submitted a bid for $8,750 to complete the core modifications Lucy had suggested. They promised to start as schedules allow in mid-November and to finish before the winter had thickened. A second contractor, Jensen Home Access, quoted $11,300, citing a need to reroute old plumbing for the curbless shower and to replace the subfloor beneath the tub to comply with code. Both bids were laid into the trunk in a new envelope, and I typed a short memo, September 10, 2026, procurement options, then stapled the pages together. The trunk accepted the figures with the same quiet neutrality it had shown toward hospital discharge papers and jam labels. There were practical obstacles. The county's small home modification grant required notarized proof of income down to the previous year's tax schedules and a contractor's detailed scope. We gathered the documents in a week: tax returns from 2025, the Social Security statements, an unsigned contractor agreement from Mason & Company, and the occupational therapist's August 12 assessment. I mailed the application on September 21, 2026. The town's volunteer coordinator wrote back on October 2, 2026, offering to notarize one of the forms at no cost and to forward a letter of support that might strengthen the case. Our Historical Society, which had photographed the trunk in 2026, supplied archival letters showing the house's provenance. Small evidence, the coordinator said, that we were preserving local fabric. On October 15, 2026, the county approved a partial grant covering up to $3,000 in materials, a figure that would not complete the work but that would soften the arithmetic. My sister's involvement during these months was pragmatic and partial. On October 4, 2026, she wired $1,200 to our account with the memo, "Home stuff. For the shower." She arrived the next week to measure the hallway and to consult with the contractor on shelving that might be moved to make room for the widening doorway. She did not move into steady contact. She did not volunteer to manage invoices or to become the primary emergency contact, but her gestures accumulated. On November 3, 2026, she came with a cold thermos of coffee and sat at the table while we sorted through paper, old insurance cards, the March 2026 hospital discharge, a photocopy of the extraction receipt for the ramp installed in 2024. She stacked the papers and labeled them with a Sharpie, and when she left she placed her phone number, in her own neat script, on a sticky note and set it inside the trunk's lid. Work began on November 18, 2026. Mason and Company showed up with a team of 3, a dumpster in the driveway, and a polite foreman named Daniel who liked to tell anecdotes about older homes as if each anecdote were a rope ladder down into a larger history. They took out the tub and found a layer of decades-old newspapers beneath the flange. A small archaeology of headlines and classifieds that Daniel correctly insisted be photographed. They raised the floor joists a touch to level the threshold, ran new tile with a subtle speckle so the floor could mask dirt yet remain non-slip, and installed the grab bars at the precise heights Lucy had noted. The contractor created a recessed shelf in the shower where a steady stream of older soap bars could rest without risk. They finished the bathroom on December 22, 2026. I marked the completion in the trunk with a Polaroid, the new shower with its handheld head and bench, my father's garden boots in the corner because habit had not yet relented. The Polaroid's caption read, "Bathroom remodel complete, December 22, 2026. Receipt enclosed." The modifications changed small, everyday things first. My mother used the new bench to sit while she scrubbed potatoes. My father preferred to take the shortest route to the sink and would, when I wasn't watching, test the shower bench with a theatrical squint as if to prove it trustworthy. The hallway nightlight prevented 2 near misses. We bought a raised seat toilet and installed it on January 5, 2027. The neighbor who had shoveled snow since 2023, who had also brought us an extra chair in 2025, helped hang an extra handrail on the back steps on January 9, 2027, after the contractor's warranty had ended and we could no longer ask them for minor favors. He accepted an envelope of cash and a jar of preserves labeled "Too sweet, good for toast." He left a note in the trunk on January 10, for the back step. Winter help. With structural risks mitigated, we turned attention to the less architectural but equally urgent problems: medication management, memory supports, and legal documents. On March 14, 2027, the clinic recommended a cognitive screening for my father after a nurse noted a missed refill and an unreturned call. We scheduled the screening for April 6, 2027. The test was cautious and calibrated. The clinician's notes from April 6, 2027 recorded mild impairments in short-term recall and a particular difficulty with new names, but they emphasized retained procedural memory, gardening schedules, the bakery hours, the cadence of the pound cake recipe. The clinician suggested a formal neuropsychological evaluation if there were further declines and recommended that we begin consolidating documents and establishing a single point of contact for prescriptions. On May 20, 2027, the 3 of us, mother, father, sister, sat at the kitchen table and talked, haltingly at first, then with more fluidity. We revised who would pick up medications and signed a contemporaneous durable power of attorney form that named my sister as the agent for health decisions in the event of incapacity. The signed form was photocopied and a copy placed in the trunk on May 21, 2027. It felt like a formalization of an already uneven reality, but it also meant fewer calls to the clinic and a clear roadmap for providers. The trunk, in these months, became more than repository, it became a ledger of intention. We added a folder with the contractor's warranties on January 3, 2027. A digital copy of the same documents went onto the flash drive on January 27, 2027, alongside a recording my mother had made that morning. Her voice reading aloud the original cake recipe, punctuated with asides about too much vanilla and less salt than you might think. She laughed in the recording at 2:03, where she always laughed when telling the story of the first time she burned the cake. We printed out the audio's timestamp and slipped the paper into the trunk. Someone came by on February 11, 2027. A volunteer from the local library's digital services program, and helped me create a second backup of the flash drive to the cloud and to a set of DVDs for safe storage. The volunteer wrote the cloud credentials in a sealed envelope and we added it to the trunk on February 11. The town's civic fabric continued to thicken around us. On March 4, 2027, the Historical Society opened a modest exhibit titled Adaptations, Domestic Interventions in Small-Town Life, 2019 to 2027. It included a photograph of the cedar trunk and a caption that drew a line between pandemic improvisations and elder-centered home modifications. My mother went once with a neighbor and kept her coat buttoned as she stood under the exhibit lights. At the reception, a councilwoman made a small speech about keeping care local, and the volunteer coordinator asked if we would be willing to speak at a community forum on home modifications in April. I declined speechmaking but agreed to show a few Polaroids and to lend the trunk for the forum's display table. The trunk, portable in its argument, traveled to the town hall on April 19, 2027, and sat open beside a sprig of dried sage. People read the labels and asked about the jars. A young man took a photograph of the label August 7, 2022 and texted it to his mother. Because life is not merely a sequence of practical fixes, there were days that registered as sentimental proof. On August 7, 2027, 2 years after the afternoon tea that had widened our relations, we marked the anniversary again. The cake had been reworked. My mother, now using a standing aid for long tasks, delegated the creaming to me but insisted on shaping the batter. The neighbor brought his chair and made a joke about not being invited in the same clipped tone my mother used in 2025. This time the humor landed as a customary benediction. My sister arrived with a bouquet of impromptu flowers and an old postcard she had found among the trunk's papers that bore a seaside stamp and a child's scroll. We opened the cardboard box I had brought. The box that had become evidence, reconciliation, and a kind of ritual tool, and we found layered inside the old flash drive, now updated with the new recordings and a short video I had made of the ramp in the rain. My father watched the video twice and then sat back and said, "That's why we did it," as if the image conferred justification. The neighbor declared the preserves breakfast done, and we took photographs that would later be printed and filed in the trunk on August 8, 2027. There were setbacks. An infection in late November about polypharmacy management. The trunk accrued those papers too. A December 2, 2027 memo from a pharmacist explaining interactions, a January 10, 2028 follow-up note that simplified the daily pills into 2, and a February 15, 2028 copy of a home health agency letter offering weekly check-ins. The pattern remained the same as before: small interventions recorded carefully, a reliance on neighbors and volunteers, the occasional monetary contribution by my sister, the trunk's steady accretion of documents. Into 2028 we moved with caution. On March 3, 2028, we met with an elder care planner at the council's offices. She spoke of continuum of care options using maps and a model of the town that had little color-coded pins. In-home supports, adult day centers, small residential alternatives. We did not sign any documents that day. We added her pamphlet to the trunk and noted a plan to reconvene in 6 months. The flash drive was updated on March 10, 2028, with a new file, a recording of my father's voice singing a verse from the wedding program he once read aloud, and this time his voice faltered only once. I burned the file to disk and placed one of the disks in a folder dated March 10, 2028. There are moments in which the ledger reveals not only a record but a prospective argument. Evidence that life can be lived with fewer incidents of catastrophic rupture if small works are sustained. We continue to test that thesis. On June 13, 2028, the county's community services published a notice of a pilot program for in-home telehealth monitoring. On July 1 we signed up, cautious about intrusions but hopeful about the safety net. The volunteer coordinator organized a rotating check-in schedule among neighbors for storm seasons on September 12, 2028, and the neighbor who had shoveled snow since 2023 agreed to be on call for severe weather. Said only, "I'm coming for the fall." She did not say whether those weeks would become a pattern, but she wrote the dates into the trunk's calendar on August 30, 2028. The cedar trunk remains where it has been, on the shelf by the pantry, a persistent presence that both witnesses and demands record. Its pages are now a timeline thick enough to hold the small seasons of care, the August 7 labels, the March 2, 2026 voice recording, the December 22, 2026 Polaroid of the new shower, the April 6, 2027 cognitive screening notes, the May 21, 2027 durable power of attorney photocopy, the cloud credentials envelope from February 11, 2027, the contractors' warranties, the county grant approval of October 15, 2026, the volunteer's note for the backstep. When a friend asks how we have managed to keep things from unraveling, I show them the trunk and the box, both small and stubborn, and explain as clearly as I can That care has been a succession of modest possible actions performed often enough to alter chance. We do not pretend the future is secure. There are days when my father's memory slips more readily than the week before, when my mother's hands slow on tasks that used to require no thought at all, when my sister's absences leave a rawness that an envelope from October cannot soothe. But the artifacts we have made, labels, receipts, recordings, contractor bids, notarized forms, have carved out a kind of temporal continuity. They have made decisions accessible to anyone who might come later, and they have made the present legible to us now. We continue to add to that archive because adding is what slow hope looks like, incremental, persistent, bureaucratic and intimate all at once, a record that holds both what has happened and what we think should happen next.